It went. Let me go back. All right. So this is the title, and I do invite you. First Timothy chapter 5. But as you can already see, I've amplified personally. These are not the Application Bible. These are words in my expansion of them. But we got through to the introduction of the widows indeed, and widows that are not widows indeed. And we're going to discuss that tonight. But as I went through it, I thought, wow, I need to slow down because this is one of the great practical studies when it comes to understanding the government of the church and the function of the church. And so the title, The Church's Responsibility Toward Widows, Ministers, and a Charge to Young Pastors. So we're going to cover all of that between now and next week. But just as a way of review for your outline, spiritual discipline in the church, and I think the blanks are filled in for these here. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 1, rebuke not an elder being not just an older man, but essentially the office of the pastor. Rebuke not an elder, but entreat him as a father, and the younger men as brethren. So you have two types of pastors here. One is the older pastor, one is the younger pastor. And so in the church's relationship with the pastor would be that you don't rebuke him, but instead you treat him as a father. You plead with him. There's a kindness, there's a respect. And we talked about that last week. And then the other, with the older men, they should be entreated as a father. I'm going to move on. And then the younger men as brethren, or correcting the younger men. So that's the approach to the pastoral office, and I don't think I need to spend any more time on it. Anybody got a comment, or can I press on? Moving on. All right. The treatment of women in the church. We dealt with this last week. And so 1 Timothy 5, verse 2, the elder women as mothers, the younger as sisters with all purity. I don't know about you. For me, as I go back and I read this passage, I'm very much refreshed by how practical it is. When you start studying through it, you say, well, that makes sense, doesn't it? But there's a lot of violation in churches of some of these things, sadly. And for us as a church, for those of us in the room here tonight, that we would understand, here's how you function. This is how you deal with relationships. So the elder women should be treated as mothers. And when you think about the treatment of a mother, what are some words that come to your mind? Loving, kind. What else?
Honor.
To honor. So, parents aren't perfect, are we? But the responsibility of showing honor and kindness is one that endures. And just a thought on this in Titus chapter 2, and I might look at this later in the summer, but the aged women likewise, that they be in behavior as becometh holiness. Now what we're going to see tonight is that the behavior of the women also has a lot to do with the responsibility of the church to those women. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then, of course, the aged women, what's their responsibility? To be teaching the young women. And it goes on and describes what the young women should be like. And so the younger women are to be addressed as sisters with all purity. Now, I don't know if you remember how I ended this last week, but it would be, as Paul's writing to Timothy, that Timothy is being reminded when it comes to dealing with younger women, you need to make sure that the relationship is pure, that it is holy, that there's no room for concern about the pastor's relationship with the younger women in the church. And probably every one of us in here have heard scandals of what have happened. I just heard of one recently, and I'll not go into it, but the pastors should be held accountable, right? I mean, just because you're the pastor doesn't mean there should not be an accountability. And so we're dealing with those two verses. I'll go back. with those two verses, you're dealing with an older pastor, you're dealing with a young pastor. And then as you come to verse 2, you're dealing with the women in the church and how they should be treated. Should be treated as mothers. The younger women are to be addressed as sisters with all purity. And I'm going to move on. Here's the verse I closed with last week. Paul writing to the believers in Corinth. Now concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me, it is good, literally morally sound, for a man not to touch a woman. So the physical relationships within a ministry, and Hillsdale is a friendly church. We're actually a shaking hands church. We can even be a hugging church, but it cannot be a clinging church. Agree? No clinging. All right. And by the way, as a husband and a pastor, the greatest check on my life and relationship with the opposite sex in the church is my wife, right? And she has X-ray vision that I've learned to appreciate over the years, and she'll see things that I just don't see it, you know. But she will see them, and invariably, she's right. And moving on with that, all right. 2 classes of widows. This is where we're going to dig in a little bit. All right, so here are the widows. 2 verses on the widows. Honor widows that are widows indeed. Now verse 4. If any widow have children or nephews, let them learn first to show piety at home and to requite their parents, for that is good and acceptable before God. Now, I'm going to make a correction on my amplified notes here that I put in here. But before I do that, let me introduce this thought to you, all right? The first is, what is a widow indeed? Well, when you look at the contrast of verse 4, a widow that has children or nephews, that's the difference. A widow indeed is a widow that does not have children. She does not have the support of children or grandchildren, perhaps even a family. So we're looking as a widow indeed, one that is dependent. She has nowhere else to turn to for help or support. So, moving on then, the contrast with that is the other kind of widow. If any widow have children or nephews, and the word nephew there could easily be translated grandchildren. Translators put nephew in there, but essentially it's family, if she has family. Let them, now this is what I wanted to correct, because I think on my notes I wrote in improperly, so I wanted to correct that. I had already printed it off and I was too cheap to go back and print it again, okay? If you need to know the truth, all right? All right, verse 4 then. If any widow have children or nephews, let them, now I think in your notes I did not state it properly. Them would be the children or the grandchildren. So them, the object of this command here in verse 4 is not the widow, it's the children and the grandchildren. So let me continue then. Let them first, learn first to show piety at home. Or you could turn it and say, let them first learn to show piety at home. So I think as I went through my notes, I improperly on verse 4 put in there something that needed to be corrected. So let me go back and read it now. Now, if any widow who has children or nephews, as opposed to the widow indeed, let them, the children or the grandchildren, who have a responsibility to the widow, first learn to show piety or godliness at home. So I'm going to go to the next one that actually has the verse. So let me walk through it. You have my verses there. You can look at it on your sheet. So let me read it to you. If any widow have children or nephews, let them, the children or the grandchildren, first learn to show piety, and that be in devotion, kindness, at home. At home being to your own family. So the first responsibility for a widow is that responsibility falls on particularly it would be the children and the grandchildren. So before a church bears a responsibility for a widow in the church, the first responsibility for the needs of a widow lies with the children and the grandchildren. Now I'm going to keep reading. And so let the children or the grandchildren show their devotion, their kindness at home. And to requite, now the word requite is to repay or to pay a debt. Pay their parents, requite their parents, for that is good and acceptable before God. Now, let's take a moment and let me break that down just a little bit, if you would allow. So let's go through this here for a moment. In fact, you have your notes there. Look at 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 8. Do you see that? 1 Timothy 5 verse 8. Just look down the sheet. It's further down. In verse 8 we read, if any provide not for his own. So there we are. We're in the midst of this whole passage about widows. So the responsibility of children and grandchildren for their widow mother or widow grandmother is that they are to take care of her first, before that responsibility rests with anyone else. Now keep reading verse 8. If any provide not for his own, especially for those of his own house, he hath denied the faith and is worse than an infidel. Those are pretty strong words, aren't they? All right. And now as I'm teaching my class here, I'm looking on class members that have had grandparents and mothers, right? Parents, and understand the responsibility of caring for widows in particular here. So let me, let's a couple of thoughts that would grow out of this. One of the 10 Commandments would address this. What would it be? The fifth one, honor thy father and thy mother. So here is that commandment now is being expressed in this verse. One of the things as I've grown older, I've learned to appreciate more and more is how much of the Old Testament is expressed in the New Testament. And when you are studying the New Testament and you know the Old Testament, all of a sudden the lights come on and you think, wow, that's where that comes from. Now, interesting, in our culture historically, what I'm teaching was accepted. It's just the way it was. Even if you were from an unsaved family background, family looked after family. The early industrial age, late 1800s, is when a lot of this started breaking down. People were leaving the farm, they were leaving the acreage that families owned, and they were moving into the city. And as a result of that, the family units started breaking down. I don't know. Did any of you grow up where you had like generations that were living on a piece of property? Any of you have that? None of you did? I'll give you just a little idea on my maternal side. My maternal side had, the name was Whitley, and they had a land grant from the King of England. Thousands and thousands and thousands of acres. Well, over the generations, the land, when it was passed on from one generation to the next, they would start selling or actually breaking off the land. So you would end up with your aunts, your uncles, they're all living on this land. By the time I came along, my grandparents were living on a 200-acre tract. Right across the road from my grandparents was my great uncle and great aunt. They were living on a 200-acre tract of land. Down next to them on the other side was would have been my great aunt and her family. They also had a 200-acre tract. So that was the way the inheritance was being passed on. Well, my grandparents ended up in the nursing home. And again, I was too young to appreciate this, ended up in the nursing home. Well, by the time they both passed away, all of the land had been sold and all the land was gone. To my knowledge, there's probably no family living on that acreage. My point I wanted to make, though, was in that land area had lived would have been my great-great-grandfather, my great-grandfather, my grandparents. They were all living in that community there. And that was typically the way it was in the 1800s. And sadly, we've lost that. Most children today don't even hardly know their grandparents anymore. It's just been a total breakdown. Anyway, that had nothing to do with anything that I'm teaching, but I thought you'd like to hear about it anyway. All right, let's look at the last part before I move on. The last part is to requite or to repay their parents. Now here's the question. Repay their parents for what? Go ahead, tell me. Taking care of you when you were young, right? This generation that stays at home until they're in their 30s, they ought to have to pay a lot by the time mom and dad pass on. But the thought here in this verse is Paul's telling Timothy, you tell the young men and women in your congregation they have a debt to pay to their parents. A responsibility that they have. And that debt to be paid is not only acceptable, pleasing to God, but it is also it's a commendable thing. Now, I don't want to rush on until I give some of you an opportunity, if you'd like, to share a testimony of your own experience of looking after mom, after dad, whatever it might be. I would love for you to do that. Who'll be the first? I'm not going to make you, but I'd love for you to. Go ahead.
Well, my mom,
Taj Mahal. Did I get it?
Taj Mahal, yes, you did.
Go ahead. And speak up so they can hear you.
She had 6 of us. My dad was American Indian, and he drank. She was a nurse, and she took care of 6 children on her own.
Wow.
It's in New York City.
In New York City. So,
wow.
Yeah, she did a lot. I mean, she sacrificed. She didn't give herself. She gave to us as best as she could. And for me, growing up and seeing that, and seeing my mom as I got older, the struggles, my heart broke for her. And so in order for me to get rid of that anguish in me, the only way I knew how to do that was to give her back everything, as little as it was, a bag of potato chips she would give me for being good. She instructed us according to the Old Testament.
So we're talking essentially a single mom, in a way.
Yes.
Raising 6 children in New York.
The best that she could. Was it perfect? No. But we were homeless, Penn Station, and she never left our side. So I appreciated that in her.
Wow.
And then seeing her get older and watching her slow down, and she had some ways about her that none of my other brothers and sisters understood or wanted to tolerate, which was her Catholicism. For me, it was more about, let's not look at the flaws. Right. Let's look at what she did, what she sacrificed. And growing up.
The verse, love covers a multitude, right?
Yes. And so for me, just to give her back that and marry a man that was in agreement with me about my mom, to love her that way, I mean, it overwhelms me, because that's the love that she gave 6 children. And 6 children, she could take care of 6 children, but 6 children couldn't look back and go, this is what you did for us. It took a few, and me being the youngest, my mom was like my hero.
Right. And she just passed away recently.
Yeah. So I still remember everything she's done. She was a giving woman. She's very loving and kind. Yeah. And I think that she imparted that to me, so I imparted it back to her.
Right. And so this verse here resonates with you. And there's sacrifices that go with it.
Yeah.
For the 2 of you.
Yes.
Yeah.
It was beautiful.
Anybody else? That was wonderful. Yeah.
And as I've aged, I've grown more and more aware of the sacrifices that my parents made for us that I didn't recognize when I was younger. I was too self-consumed with, my life and what I was going to do and what Randy and I would do together, and I didn't recognize all the sacrifices they made for us by, putting us in Christian school. It was a sacrifice from our parents, and giving us music lessons and sending us to the wilds. So many, just their time investment. So I owe a debt I could never repay. My mother's still living. I owed debt I could never repay, no matter if my name was Elon Musk. I could not repay. Because how can you give somebody money back for what they've given you, their time? You can't
Right.
buy someone's time. And I'm a blessed woman.
The time, the sacrifice of life, and maybe even the sacrifice of dreams. I sometimes tell my kids that their music represents 2 sports cars I should have owned. But you know, at the time, you give and you sacrifice because you're wanting to see them prosper, and not financially. You want to see them prosper and develop their talents and abilities. Somebody else.
Hey, Pastor, I will
Yeah.
just add one last thing. But by taking her in, I mean, we did this for like off and on 14 years till the very end. And God provided a way to have her buried next to her daughter in Illinois. I mean, we was able to fly her back, you know, and have a wonderful funeral back there. But I believe throughout the whole time that, you know, although it was tough, but God's blessings. I mean, we were blessed financially and in every other kind of way too, just for the honor
Wow.
that was given. Yeah.
Please God.
Yeah. You know, Sheila's mom, you know, lives at the coast. She's will turn 91 this year, and we bought the house we did, planning that when she's ready and she needs to move, that we're ready for her. And she wants to be independent as long as she can. But we watched Sheila's mom and dad take care of his mother. And she died probably early 90s. But she had forsaken him as a boy. I mean, back in the time that you don't do that, well, she did. She left the boys, went off, and didn't come back until they were like teenagers, you know. And I watched him particularly. He retired to start looking after his mom at home. Sheila's mom was still working. And he spent most of the rest of the years of his life taking care of a mother who had not taken care of him. And I thought, wow, and this is one thing, but it's quite another to know that you were abandoned and still served. So, don't you love the fact as you go through the scriptures that you start seeing things? It's like, you know, maybe we did it out of instinct. Maybe we really weren't thinking it through, but we realize that the spiritual principles are there and part of our life. Let me move on and give you another thought. Let's talk about the widow indeed just for a moment. And I wanted to point out some things to you that may not be recognized immediately. So let me read. Now she that is a widow indeed, now we all know that means a widow without family, a widow without children, a widow without anyone to look after her needs. Now she that is a widow indeed, and what's the word? Desolate. Now we have a qualification for this widow. All right? Trusteth in God and continueth in supplications and prayers night and day. So here's a couple of things. Let's talk about the identity of the widow indeed. So it's more than the fact that she doesn't have children or grandchildren, but it is that she is desolate. No means of support, no ability to care for her own financial needs. Another word would be maybe forsaken. I don't know if that's on your outline there, but it could be that she has children and they forsook her, like Taj Mahal was describing. She took mom in, but let's say if she hadn't have, then mom would have been forsaken, desolate. And so that's one of the qualities then of where the church's responsibility is to a widow, is that she's desolate. Another is that she trusteth in God. Wow, okay, so now we're talking about not widows, just any widow, but we're talking about specific widows. So not only a widow who is desolate, but number two, a widow who is a believer. She trusteth in God. The testimony of her life is one of trusting in God. We'd put it in another way. She is a woman of faith, right? A woman of faith. And then you'll need to look, well, let me add these. I should do that quickly. She is a believer, testimony, she trusteth in God. And then 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 9, you may not have seen this before, but there's a qualification of her age as well. 1 Timothy 5:9, let not a widow be taken into the number of what? The number of the widows indeed, under 60 years old. How old is that? 60 years old, having been the wife of one man. And so that's another qualification there. It's dealing with her testimony, her character. So now we're dealing with desolate, trusteth in God, and age 60 or older. Now I'm going to answer the question, why 60? So give me a moment to go there, all right? So the testimony of the widow indeed is what we're looking at. So here's her testimony. She continueth in supplications and prayers night and day. So this woman is a godly woman, right? Now again, every child, every grandchild has a responsibility for mom as a widow. That's all right. But this is where the church's responsibility is. So the testimony of the widow is important. I shared with you, maybe it was last week, about having a widow many years ago who kept having money problems until we finally nailed down where is your money going? You're retired military, you're retired from your other career, you've got money, where is it going? Well, she's going to Seminole Casino, and she was telling us she was playing bingo. I don't know if you can play bingo at the casino, but I know she was going through the money, right? And so we picked up the phone and we called her son and then called her daughter and said, you've got a problem. Not we've got a problem, you've got a problem. And fortunately, that daughter took her in, which was a good thing. She needed that. So she is to be a devout woman. Let me see, what else? All right. And she is to be a virtuous woman. Again, verse 6, she that liveth in pleasure is dead while she liveth, and these things give in charge that they may be blameless. So the qualities of the woman, the widow to whom the church is responsible for, is very much here. I want to keep moving because I'm not going to be able to get to the younger if I don't. So the believer's care and support for the widows indeed. So let's go back to verse 8. If any provide not for his own widow, especially primarily for those of his own house, he hath denied the faith and is worse than an infidel. So the responsibility of the body of believers does not supersede that of the family. The family has to feel the obligation. And over the years, the deacons here, along with the staff, but particularly the deacons, have stepped into dealing with situations with families and either calling them or going to their door and knocking on the door and said, we need to talk because your mom is in need. And sometimes the children aren't even aware of that. We had something like that happen a while ago. And the family just didn't know there was a need. They didn't know. They didn't know she was coming to the church and saying, I need money. And so we stepped into that too. Moving on. The church's obligation to its widow then. Let's talk about this for a moment. So let not a widow, I've got to get caught up in my notes here. All right, here we go. Let not a widow be taken into the number under 60 years old, having been the wife of one man, well reported of for good works, if she have brought up children, if she have lodged children, if she have washed the saints' feet, if she have relieved the afflicted, if she have diligently followed every good work. So you got quite a testimony, right, in this passage here. So here's the thought then. The church's obligation is primarily focused on widows 60 and older. That's what you take away from this, and then I'll tell you why in a moment. And we've already looked at her testimony. A testimony of good works was essential, and I won't read those again. You can interrupt me in a moment, and I'll give you an opportunity. All right, and she's to be treated with honor and dignity and given special care and consideration. Over the years, my ministry has particularly been with widows that would end up in nursing homes, and they had nothing. And we've had several like that over the years I could describe to you. And sometimes when they have nothing in this life and do not have the affection of their children, they are all alone. And I've been very blessed over the years. There's so many I could name. I don't want to, because I know this goes out on the internet and it's out there to stay. But some that I've visited in some pretty rough places. You know, some of the nursing homes are really, really bad. They're just not good. Others you can go in and they're very nice, but you have to have the money to be in that nursing home. And but I've had the joy. There's so many funny stories I could tell you. There was one who was in a nursing home on Davis Island. It's an old building, probably early 1900s, probably down there. And I would come in the front door. Very few people ever visited there. And I'd come in the door, and somebody sitting behind the desk, they would say, "Tell so-and-so the pastor's here." You know, so it goes out all over this big lobby. And I would go in and visit. I remember one particular visit, and she really had a bad attitude, and it was very unusual. Historically, she was a very godly, loving, caring woman, but in the last years of her life, her dementia was catching up with her. And as she's talking, I finally said, "You know, you've got a bad attitude." She says, "I do not." I said, "Yes, you do have a bad attitude." She said, "I parked it." I said, "Your attitude?" I said, "I'd like to know where you parked it." And she says, "It's out there at the curb." And I said, "I got news for you. Your attitude's not at the curb. Your attitude's here." So it was fun. It was fun. I shared with you last week visiting a widow and going in, and I noticed all of her heirloom silver. It's gone. Her card's gone. And found out a dirty nephew had come in, and he had taken everything that she owned, had it in his name. And it only took a phone call to the other nephew and the niece, and they got down here and threatened to put him in prison. So that all worked out well. So many others. I've had some wonderful people over the years I visited. Let me go to the younger widows. Let me go ahead and dig a hole and get in trouble, not with you, but this will probably be picked up by some. So we talked about the widows indeed, who are the older widows with no children. But let's talk about the younger widows. 1 Timothy 5, verse 11, the younger widows refuse. Now, here's a question. Younger than what? What's the chronological age? 60 years old, right? So 60 years old. So younger widow is 60 or younger, all right? But the younger widow refuse. Now, let's look at what that means in a moment. For when they have begun to wax wanton against Christ, they will marry. So let's look at that. Let's look at the word meanings here. 1 Timothy 5, verse 11. The younger, the new, the youthful widows refuse, literally reject. Now, not reject them out of the church, but you don't bear the responsibility for them like you do the widows indeed. Now, moving on. For when they, being the younger widows, have begun to wax wanton, that is, a desire arises within them, and that desire would be marriage, companionship, all right? Wax wanton against Christ, they will marry. Now, I want to explain what that means, and hopefully you'll believe that this is a good insight. Younger widows were expected to remarry and not become the church's responsibility. That's why the 60 and younger, the younger widows, were expected and encouraged to get married. Now, there's something in our culture today, even in the churches, that there is a negative shadow on that. But historically, when a woman, younger woman, would become a widow through accident, death, whatever, the husband, she's a widow. The attitude of the society was she will need to remarry. Now, I'm going to move on, then you can debate with me, all right? Unlike widows indeed, young widows were not anticipated to rely on the church. They're young enough to remarry. Now, the reason today children do not want to see their parents, a widowed parent, get remarried is selfish. It has everything to do with the inheritance. I've seen it over and over and over again. The children are not interested in the happiness of their mother or their father. They're interested in, if that mother or father gets remarried, that they're not going to get their inheritance. Again, we can debate in a little bit. I knew this was going to be a hot button. When it hits the internet and somebody picks this up, it's going to be happy days are here again. All right. Number 2, Timothy was to caution the younger widows not to be, here's the point, hasty in vowing and fully committing themselves to Christ and a life of celibacy. When a younger widow was grieving the death of her husband, and her leaning on the Lord and her embrace of the Lord and her love for the Lord would have been flowering. And the temptation would have been to just dedicate the rest of my life to Christ and living a life of celibacy and godliness. So when you look at the verse there, and I'm going to go back, the younger widows refuse. For when they have begun to wax wanton against Christ, against their vow to Christ. So there arises a longing for companionship, a longing for a relationship within that young widow. But if she was encouraged to dedicate herself wholly to Christ, now she's made a vow, but there's an urging within her as a younger widow to want a relationship. But that relationship suddenly seems to go contrary to her vow to Christ. And Paul makes the observation, when she starts having that longing, that natural urge, they will marry. But we know that in the Old Testament, the vows were to be sacred. So the urging of Paul to Timothy was for Timothy to not tell the young women not to rush into this vow of celibacy. So I'll give you a moment. All right, here we go. Let me give you another. 1 Corinthians 7 through 9. I would that all men were even as I myself, Paul writes. Now, it is believed that Paul may have been married at one time. So I will say that. Not sure. We can debate it, but it doesn't matter. Only we know what the Scripture says. Every man hath his proper gift of God, one after this manner and another after that. Again, he's talking now about being wholly dedicated to the Lord. So moving on. I say therefore to the unmarried and widows, it is good for them if they abide even as I. So that gives us the insight that, well, at this point in life, it would appear that he is unmarried. Verse 9. But if they cannot contain that longing, that desire, that passion, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn. I'm going to move on before I get in trouble. All right. Number 3. A young widow then who hastily committed herself to Christ in celibacy may become frustrated and sin, breaking her vow that she had made to Christ, or frustrated in her failure to be able to have a relationship that she would long for. Do I have anything else to fill in there, or can I open it to you? Do I have a couple more things? Let me tell you why she should marry. Younger widows. Having damnation because they have cast off their first faith. So she made a vow. Now she wants to get married. She wants to have a physical relationship. She wants the companionship. And so she's made a vow, but now she's wanting to break the vow. You can find the emotional, spiritual confusion. Now, verse 13. And withal, why should young widows get married? And withal, they learn to be idle. Why should young widows get married? Why should young women get married? Because they got time on their hands. Wandering about, going from house to house. Not only idle lazy, not actively working, but they're tattlers, they're gossipers, they're idle talkers, babblers, foolish talkers, and also busybodies, speaking things which they ought not. When a young widow doesn't have children, if she doesn't have grandchildren, if she doesn't have a husband, she's got a lot of time on her hands. And invariably, they end up using their idle time to go from house to house. Today we would say on Facebook, they're on Instagram, they're texting, they're emailing, they're idle. And we've got a lot of that in this culture now. They are tattlers, they're gossipers, idle talkers, babblers, foolish talkers. They're busybodies. They're meddling in other people's affairs and business, speaking things which they ought not. Here's one of the great reasons that I would like to see young women in a ministry especially get married, because they've got too much time on their hands if they're not married. But when you're married, you have a husband, you have children, and you don't have time to go from house to house talking and babbling. You have responsibilities. Now, take your best shot. Go ahead. Do you see the practicality of 1 Timothy 5 and how it just flows through? So here's my point to you. We ought to encourage single women to be married. It's good for them to be occupied with life and family and households. You want me to keep going? I got 2 more blanks, right? All right, young widows should be encouraged to remarry. Bottom line, I will therefore, here's my point, that the younger women marry, bear children, guide the house, give none occasion to the adversary to speak reproachfully, for some are already turned aside after Satan. How about that? We ought to, as believers, be in the encouraging the marrying business, because women who are younger and they have idle time, they end up getting into problems invariably. Let me give you the last one. That believers were expected to care for widows in their families. If any widow, any man or woman that believeth have widows, let them relieve them, help them, aid them, assist them. Let not the church be charged or burdened, that it may relieve them that are widows indeed.